I never thought I'd find myself in this position. 5 years into my marriage, and everything seemed fine. Not perfect, but fine. My name's Michael, and for as long as I could remember, I believed I'd married the love of my life. Betty was someone you noticed right away: bright green eyes, an easy smile that could light up a room, and a laugh that used to make me forget the world for a few seconds. Our relationship started like most, fast and intense. We met in college, back when we were both full of ambition and curiosity. She studied psychology, while I dove headfirst into law. We weren't the perfect match on paper, but something about our differences drew us together. Opposites attract, they say. After a whirlwind romance, we tied the knot, and for the first few years, everything clicked. We were the couple people admired. We threw the best parties, had witty banter that made us seem perfect to outsiders, and lived a comfortable life in a house I'd worked hard to afford. I became a partner at a law firm, while Betty took a job as a counselor, helping troubled teens navigate their chaotic lives. It seemed like a noble profession, something that reflected her compassionate nature, or so I thought. If you'd asked me back then, I would have told you that I had the dream life. But hindsight is always 20/20. Now I realize there were signs, little cracks in the foundation that I chose to ignore. I chalked it up to the natural wear and tear of marriage, but in truth, those cracks were gaping holes. One thing always nagged at me. Betty started spending more time with her best friend Kylie. They were inseparable after Kylie's divorce. I never liked Kylie, if I'm being honest. She was wild and impulsive, the kind of woman who never seemed satisfied with anything. She moved from one relationship to another, convinced that men were the problem, not her. I couldn't help but notice the way Betty changed after spending so much time with her. She became more distant, often coming home late, sometimes reeking of cigarettes and wine, things I knew Kylie indulged in. But I trusted my wife. I didn't have much choice. I buried myself in my work, coming home late myself, and chalked it up to stress when she seemed off. We weren't arguing, but we weren't connecting either. And sex. That had become a once-in-a-blue-moon thing, which I chalked up to us both being busy and tired. A stupid excuse, I know now. Then there were the moments that, looking back, should have raised a red flag. A few months before our anniversary, Betty had asked, completely out of the blue, "Do you ever feel like you're missing out on life?" It was one of those questions that seems harmless at first. I thought she meant the usual stuff, vacations we didn't take, new hobbies we hadn't tried, but there was something in her tone, a deeper layer I missed. I shrugged it off, offering her a lazy smile and saying, we'll make time for all that. We're still young. But the look on her face, the subtle frown that followed, didn't sit right with me. As the days passed, she spent more time with Kylie, sometimes not coming home until the early hours of the morning. When I asked where she'd been, she'd laugh it off and say, just catching up with the girls. Kylie's going through a rough patch. I knew Kylie had her issues, but it seemed strange that a rough patch could last this long. I didn't want to be the jealous husband. I had friends who became possessive when their wives spent time with other people, and I didn't want to be like that. I wanted to trust Betty, but trust only works if it's reciprocated. As our 5th wedding anniversary approached, I hoped that a nice night out would reset things. Maybe we just needed to spend more time together, reconnect. I planned a dinner at a high-end restaurant, the kind of place where the lighting is low, the wine is overpriced, and the atmosphere practically begs for romance. I had it all figured out. We'd talk, laugh, and maybe, just maybe, things would get back to how they used to be. What I didn't know then was that this night would mark the beginning of the end. On the night of our anniversary, I picked Betty up after work. She was dressed to kill, wearing a sleek black dress that hugged her curves just right. For a moment, I forgot about all the weirdness from the past few months. She looked stunning, and for the first time in a while, I felt excited to spend time with her. The restaurant was perfect. Low lights, soft music, the kind of place where conversation feels intimate even with other people around. We ordered a bottle of wine, and for the first time in weeks, Betty seemed happy. Not the forced smile she'd been giving me lately, but genuinely happy. I could see a sparkle in her eyes, the one I fell in love with. We talked about old times, shared a few laughs about the early days of our relationship. I felt like we were finally reconnecting. But then, as the main course arrived, she leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, her expression shifting from playful to serious. "Michael, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about," she said, her voice low but firm. My heart did a weird little flip in my chest. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes darting to the candle flickering between us before meeting mine again. "I've been thinking a lot lately about our marriage." I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue, but a sinking feeling began to claw at my stomach. "I love you," she started, and for a second, I felt relieved. "But I've realized that I need something more." More, I repeated, my mind racing to keep up. She nodded, her expression soft but determined. I've been thinking about it for a while now. I feel like I've lost myself, like I've been living as someone's wife for so long that I don't even know who I am anymore. I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. What are you getting at? I need to find myself, she said, her voice steady. And part of that means exploring things with other men. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Her words hung in the air, suffocating me. It felt like I'd been sucker punched. And for a moment, all I could do was sit there, staring at her like she'd spoken a different language. Other men. This was supposed to be our anniversary dinner, a night to celebrate us. And instead, Betty was telling me she wanted to sleep with other people. I tried to compose myself, but the disbelief kept rising, choking me. Are you serious right now? Betty's gaze didn't falter. She looked me straight in the eyes like she'd rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in her head. Michael, please try to understand. This isn't about you. It's about me. I need to figure out who I am outside of our marriage. I feel trapped. And I think that if I can explore this side of myself, I can become a better wife. A better wife? I echoed, incredulous. By sleeping with other men. She winced, but quickly composed herself. It's not just about sex, it's about experiences, about discovering myself. I'm not saying I don't love you. I do. But I need to do this. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. My stomach churned, and I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. The candlelight between us flickered, mocking the intimacy we were supposed to be sharing. I wanted to shout, to demand she take it all back, but I was too stunned to speak. Betty pressed on, her voice low as if she were trying to keep the conversation from spreading to the nearby tables. I'm not asking for a divorce, Michael. I'm asking for your support. I want to stay married, but I need your permission to explore other relationships. I shook my head, struggling to make sense of it all. You want my permission to cheat? No, she said quickly, as if that word would make it all sound worse. Not cheat. We would be open about it. We'd have boundaries, rules, but I need the freedom to see other people. I think it will help me be more present in our marriage. I stared at her, trying to comprehend how she could say these things with such calm conviction. Like she was proposing we get a new dog or repaint the living room. My mind was spinning, replaying the past few months, her late nights, the extra time with Kylie, her increasing distance. It all started to make sense in the worst possible way. Kylie put you up to this, didn't she? I asked, my voice hardening. I knew her best friend had always been a bad influence, especially after her own messy divorce. It was no secret Kylie had jumped from one guy to the next, claiming she was finding herself too. And now she had Betty pulling the same bullshit. Betty frowned, shaking her head. No, this isn't Kylie's idea. It's mine. I've been thinking about this for a long time. It's about me, not her. But I didn't buy it for a second. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to explode. My heart pounded in my chest, the noise of the restaurant around us becoming a distant hum. I wanted to scream at her, to accuse her of betraying me, of being selfish and cruel, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt hollow, like the foundation of my entire life had just been ripped away from beneath me. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Betty's eyes widened in surprise as I grabbed my jacket and threw some cash on the table. Where are you going? She asked, her voice wavering slightly for the first time. I need some air, I muttered, walking away before I said something I couldn't take back. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face when I stepped outside. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the busy street, trying to breathe, trying to think. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, betrayal. I could still hear her voice in my head, calmly asking me to let her sleep with other men. How the hell had we gotten here? I walked for what felt like hours, my thoughts a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to storm back into that restaurant and demand she take it all back. Another part of me wanted to pack up my things and leave her right then and there. But no matter what I thought, one thing was painfully clear: our marriage, as I knew it, was over. I ended up at a bar, drowning my shock in whiskey. I didn't text her. I didn't call. I just sat there staring blankly at the bottles behind the counter, wondering where the hell it had all gone wrong. Hours passed, and by the time I made it back home, Betty was already there, sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap like she'd been waiting for me. The tension in the room was suffocating. Michael, she said softly, we need to talk. No, we don't, I replied coldly, walking past her toward the bedroom. But she got up and followed me. Please, just hear me out, she begged, her voice cracking slightly now. I know this is a lot to take in, but I'm not trying to hurt you. I love you, and I want us to stay together. I just need more freedom. Freedom. I spun around to face her, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. You want freedom, then go get it. But you're not doing it while living in my house. Her eyes widened in shock. What? Michael, you don't mean that. Oh, I do, I said, my voice steady with resolve. If you want to date other men, then you can find somewhere else to live. I'm not going to sit around and watch you destroy our marriage. Michael, please, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I thought you'd understand. Understand. I scoffed. You're asking me to be okay with you sleeping around. What exactly am I supposed to understand? She didn't have an answer for that, and the silence that followed was louder than any argument we could have had. Finally, she wiped her eyes and nodded, her voice small. Fine. I'll go stay with Kylie for a while. Maybe we both need some space. Maybe, I muttered, turning away from her. As she packed a bag, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her. It was surreal. This was the woman I'd vowed to spend the rest of my life with, and now she was leaving to explore her freedom with other men. It felt like a bad dream, but I knew I wasn't waking up from this one. Not anytime soon. When she left, the house felt colder, emptier. But I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't live like this. If she thought she could come back and resume our life like nothing had happened, she had another thing coming. The days after Betty moved out felt like stepping into a void. The silence in the house was unsettling at first, like the absence of her presence was something physical, an empty weight pressing down on me. I told myself this was just temporary, that maybe she'd snap out of this ridiculous idea and come to her senses. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't something that could be undone with a few apologies and a couple of therapy sessions. She was gone, and I wasn't sure I wanted her back. A week passed. Then, too, I buried myself in work, taking on extra cases at the firm just to keep my mind off things. It worked, mostly. The routine of courtrooms, meetings, and late nights behind my desk kept me grounded, but every now and then, I'd get a flash of that dinner conversation, her calm, measured voice telling me she needed to sleep with other men to find herself. It was a joke, a cruel one, but one I was living. I didn't reach out to Betty. I didn't even know what I'd say if I did. I wanted to be angry, but more than anything, I just felt numb. I wasn't ready to process the loss, wasn't ready to admit that my marriage was in its death throes. Instead, I let the silence between us stretch out, figuring she'd contact me when she was ready to talk. But when she finally did, it wasn't the conversation I expected. It was a Thursday night. I'd just gotten home from work, poured myself a drink, and was about to collapse onto the couch when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a late work email. But when I saw Betty's name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. For a second, I thought maybe she'd come to her senses, that she was calling to tell me she wanted to come home, that this whole thing was a mistake. I answered, half expecting her voice to be filled with regret, but that wasn't the case. Hey, Michael, she said, her voice light, almost casual. How are you? How am I? I repeated, incredulous. Betty, what do you think? You left our house, our marriage, and now you're asking how I'm doing. She sighed, the sound grating against my already frayed nerves. I know this has been hard for you, but I've been thinking a lot. I still want to do this. I need to. Need to do what, exactly? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I started seeing someone, she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His name's Jake. He's been amazing, honestly. He understands me in ways I didn't think were possible. The room spun and I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter to steady myself. Seeing someone. It was real now. Not just some hypothetical idea she was toying with. She was already moving on. Dating. And not just dating. Sleeping with other men. Are you serious right now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm being honest with you, Michael. Like we agreed, she said, her tone maddeningly calm. I didn't want to keep this from you. I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. We didn't agree on anything. Betty, you walked out. That's not exactly an agreement. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought maybe I'd finally broken through that wall she'd built around herself. But then she spoke again, her voice soft and pleading. I know this is hard for you. I know. But I'm asking you to trust me, please. This will make me a better person, a better wife in the long run. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words sink in. A better wife. There was no marriage left to save. Not with her out there dating Jake or whoever else she thought would help her find herself. The more she talked, the clearer it became that she wasn't coming back. Not really. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Betty, if you're serious about this, then we're done. I'm not going to sit around while you screw other guys and expect me to just wait for you to figure it out. Michael, don't say that, she pleaded. I'm doing this for us. For us, I almost laughed, the bitterness spilling out. There's no us anymore, not after this. She went quiet, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. I didn't know if she was crying or if she was just trying to figure out how to respond. But at that moment, I didn't care. I was done. Finally done. Don't call me again, Betty, I said, my voice cold and final. If you want to explore your freedom, do it far away from me. I hung up before she could respond. That conversation was the last straw. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't want to drag this out, didn't want to hold on to something that was already dead. I met with the attorney a few days later, laid everything out on the table, and began the process of filing for divorce. It wasn't easy. We had assets to split, financial entanglements to sort through, but I knew it had to be done. The paperwork was the least painful part. The emotional wreckage, that was harder to sift through. Betty didn't fight the divorce, but she didn't make it easy either. I heard through the grapevine, mainly mutual friends, that she was still staying with Kylie and had been dating multiple men, not just Jake. Her finding herself was in full swing. I tried not to think about it too much, but there were nights when I lay awake, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. A month passed. Then, too, I kept my head down, focusing on the divorce, work, and trying to move on. But just as I started to feel like I was getting back on my feet, Betty showed up at the house one evening. I heard the doorbell ring, and when I opened the door, there she was standing on the porch with a suitcase in hand, looking like she thought she could just waltz back in. "Michael, I've been thinking," she started, her voice uncertain for the first time in a while. "So I want to come home. I want to come in Ohio and Begas." I stared at her, dumbfounded. After everything she'd put me through, she really thought she could just show up and everything would be fine? That I'd just open the door and welcome her back like nothing had happened? "No," I said flatly, "you can't." Her eyes widened in shock. "What? Michael, we're still married. This is my home too." "So not anymore," I replied, stepping aside to show her the stack of papers on the table. "I've filed for divorce. The court has already issued a restraining order. You're not allowed here." Her mouth fell open, and for the first time I saw real panic in her eyes. "Michael, you can't do this. I made a mistake, okay? I'll come back. We can fix this." But it was too late. I'd given her the chance to fix it, and she'd thrown it away for some ridiculous idea of freedom. Now there was no going back. "I'm done, Betty," I said firmly. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." She stood there for a moment, her hands trembling as she gripped the handle of her suitcase. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. It wasn't long after that I found out through a mutual friend that Betty had gotten herself into trouble. She'd been seeing some guy, a new one, not Jake, and gotten pregnant. And to make matters worse, she'd contracted a sexually transmitted infection in the process. It was a bitter pill to swallow. I couldn't deny the sense of vindication I felt, knowing that her grand experiment in self-discovery had backfired so spectacularly. But it wasn't something I took any joy in. It was just sad. I loved her once, and watching her life spiral out of control was a reminder of what could have been, what should have been, if things had turned out differently. By the time the divorce was finalized, I was ready to move on. Betty's descent into chaos was behind me, and I was focused on building a new life for myself, one without the baggage of betrayal and broken promises. It was during this time that I met Laura. She was everything Betty wasn't: grounded, kind, steady. So we started slow, but as the months passed, our relationship grew into something real, something solid. So there were no secrets, no games, just the kind of honest, simple love I'd been missing for so long. We've been together for nearly a year now, and we're already talking about marriage. Kids, too, someday. I can't believe I'm saying this after everything that happened, but I'm hopeful again. For the first time in a long time, I can see a future that isn't clouded by betrayal. Betty is a distant memory now, a lesson in what can go wrong when people forget what commitment really means. But Laura, she's the real deal. And for the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The day the divorce was finalized, I expected to feel a flood of emotions: anger, sadness, maybe even regret. But what I felt most was relief. It wasn't the kind of relief you get from finishing something you hated, but the kind that comes after a long, grueling journey. It was like taking off a heavy coat after walking through a storm. My marriage to Betty was over, and with it, all the pain and betrayal she'd brought into my life. The papers had been signed, the assets divided, and Betty's chaotic presence was officially removed from my life, for good. I'd walked out of that courtroom lighter than I'd felt in years, knowing I wouldn't have to deal with her drama anymore. Word traveled quickly, as it always does in tight-knit circles. Our mutual friends, at least the ones who hadn't already cut ties, reached out with cautious sympathy. Most of them had seen it coming long before I did. Betty's behavior hadn't exactly been subtle, especially after she moved in with Kylie. And once the news broke about her pregnancy and the STI, well, people couldn't stop talking. It was a train wreck. And even though I wasn't in it anymore, I could still see the smoke from a distance. I didn't ask for details about her life after the divorce. I didn't care anymore. Betty had made her choices, and she was living with the consequences. The last I heard, the guy she'd gotten pregnant by had bailed, leaving her alone to deal with both the baby and her mess of a life. Kylie, of course, was still around, but even she couldn't fix what Betty had broken. The funny thing is, as much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't. Not anymore. What was the point? Betty had wrecked herself without my help. She thought she was chasing some grand version of freedom, but all she'd found was loneliness. And now she had a child on the way with no stable partner and a disease to manage. It was tragic, really, but it wasn't my tragedy anymore. As for me, my life had taken a turn for the better. My relationship with Laura was like stepping into a whole new world. She was everything I didn't even know I needed. Where Betty had been volatile, unpredictable, Laura was calm, steady, and warm. Her laughter filled the spaces that had once been so painfully empty. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. We met through a mutual friend at a dinner party about 6 months after the divorce. At first, I wasn't even thinking about dating. How could I? I'd just gone through a marital train wreck. But there was something about Laura that drew me in. She had this quiet strength about her, a confidence that didn't demand attention but simply existed. She didn't try to fix me or push me into anything I wasn't ready for. She just listened, was there, and let things unfold naturally. Before long, what started as casual dates turned into late-night conversations and weekends spent together. There was no rush, no pressure. It was as if both of us had been through enough to know that building something real took time, and this time I wanted to do it right. One night, about a year into our relationship, Laura and I were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. It was one of those perfect evenings where everything feels just a little more vivid, the sky a deeper orange, the air warmer, the moment fuller. And we hadn't talked about marriage yet, but it had been on my mind for a while. Laura wasn't just someone I was dating. She was my partner, my best friend, and the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. I looked over at her, the soft glow of the setting sun lighting up her face, and I knew this was it. This was what love was supposed to feel like: peaceful, secure, and strong. Nothing like the storm I'd lived through with Betty. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice low but sure, "about our future, about us." She turned to me, her blue eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Yeah, what about us?" I reached for her hand, pulling her a little closer. "I want us to build something together, a family, a life." Her smile widened, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. She knew where I was going, and she was ready for it. "I love you, Laura," I continued, my heart pounding, "and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" To marry me? For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world around us went quiet, and all I could focus on was her face, her eyes filling with happy tears. Then, without hesitation, she nodded, her smile radiant as she whispered, "Yes, of course, yes." That night marked a new beginning. Man, Laura and I didn't rush into a wedding, but we started planning our life together, talking about a future that included a home filled with love, maybe kids, and most importantly, a commitment that meant something real. I wasn't the same man I had been when I married Betty. I'd learned some hard lessons along the way, but those lessons had brought me here, to Laura. Well, we bought a house a few months later, a cozy place just outside the city, with a big backyard and enough space to start a family when the time came. For now, it was just us, and that was more than enough. Betty was a chapter 1 closed, but every now and then, her shadow would drift through my thoughts. I'd hear from friends that she was struggling, that her life had taken another bad turn, and I'd wonder how things might have been different if she hadn't been so desperate for something more. But those thoughts never lingered for long. I'd moved on, and so had she in her own way. As the months passed, Laura and I built something solid, something real. There were no secrets, no lies, no need for freedom outside of each other. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. A year later, as I stood at the altar, watching Laura walk toward me in her white dress, I felt a calm I'd never known before. There was no doubt, no fear, no lingering bitterness from the past. Just love, pure, simple, and strong. But when she reached me, I took her hands in mine, and we exchanged our vows. As we promised to spend our lives together, I knew that this time it was real. This time it was forever. And for the first time in years, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was finally free. Free from the pain, the betrayal, and the chaos of the past. Free to start again. With Laura by my side, I was finally home.